It's my pleasure to welcome Graeme Scott to share with us today. Graeme is the Director of SIL, an organisation that Croydon Hills Baptist has had a long association with through Wendy and David Nichols and Raywin and Peter Brook. Welcome, Graeme. It's great to see you today.
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to be here.
Graeme, could you explain for us what SIL is as an organisation?
Yeah, so SIL is a global organisation, and our focus is seeing individuals and communities flourish using the languages that they value the most. So our focus is kind of community development work, but where language is the tool of engagement.
Fantastic. And many people connect that with Wycliffe Bible translators, which obviously there's a strong connection between the two organisations. Now, you mentioned before that you're a global organisation. The last 18 months with pandemic and restrictions on international travel must have impacted you as an organisation. How has that changed life for SIL?
I think the biggest single change we've seen is the lack of travel, of course. And so we've got some consultants who are based here in Australia, who work on my team, have not been able to get overseas to work. So there's a literacy consultant, and a health consultant, and Bible translation consultants. And so some of that work moves online, but some of that work also has to stop because remote communities don't have access to telephone lines, leave alone internet and Zoom. I think too, obviously we've been online for all of our training. Most of our training has been online. So it has stretched us and our ability to work out how do we do these practical training things? How do you teach someone how to learn a language via Zoom? The kind of activities that we normally would teach with, now we've had to rethink. So that's been a challenge, but it's also been a good challenge because it's pushed us to rethink and to be a bit more courageous, I think, as we engage. Yes, there's two areas. I guess also our thing is that our community here in Melbourne, we've gotten used to not seeing each other. We're only seeing each other on Zoom. But that has had an impact, I think, on our relationships and also the efficiency of our work.
Mm. Yeah, there's some real needs that you're mentioning there. And as we all know, just because the means change, it doesn't mean that the mission has reduced in any way, shape or form. That still is what drives us all. As an organisation, Graeme, how can Croydon Hills Baptist Church be praying for not only for you personally, but also for SIL?
I think continued prayer, I think we'd really appreciate prayer. Yeah, just the continuing juggling of this awkward time in which we're all living, for wisdom. And the importance that we continue to work to be a healthy and caring community. Because this era brings challenges and stresses that are new and unique. People get worn down. The other thing I think would be great to be praying for is we're about to embark on a diaspora project here in Melbourne and trying to understand and map where diaspora peoples and communities are in order that we perhaps can start to engage with those communities and their languages. And so that as we start that new project, that'd be a great thing to be praying for as we kind of work out how this is going to come together. And and the outcomes, of course, for those communities.
Now, that's a fancy term there, Graeme. Can you explain to us what diaspora means, just so when we're praying, we're more aware?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so diaspora. So again, Melbourne, I guess, and I'm not a Melburnian, but thinking about places like Dandenong and the Sudanese communities in Dandenong, or historically the Vietnamese in Springvale. So it's all those immigrant communities or refugee communities that are scattered all across this enormous city. And many of them now are coming into Australia. Of course, they're learning English, they're adapting, but they've still maintained their own identity with their language, with their languages and culture. And they're grappling with issues about how do we pass this down to our children. And you're familiar with this, I think, a little bit at Croydon Hills because of your long connection with the Karenni congregation. So just seeking to understand that as it plays out across this very big city.
That sounds some very exciting things to be praying for. Thanks so much for just briefly sharing with us, and we're looking forward to listening to you later on in our service today.
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to be here.
Job chapter 29, verse 1 to 25. I long for the years gone by when God took care of me.
When he lit up the way before me and I walked safely through the darkness.
When I was in my prime, God's friendship was felt in my home.
The Almighty was still with me, and my children were around me.
My steps were awash in cream, and the rocks gushed olive oil for me.
Those were the days when I went to the city gate and took my place among the honoured leaders.
The young stepped aside when they saw me, and even the aged rose in respect at my coming.
The princes stood in silence and put their hands over their mouths. The highest officials of the city stood quietly, holding their tongues in respect.
All who heard me praised me. All who saw me spoke well of me.
For I assisted the poor in their need, and the orphans who required help.
I helped those without hope, and they blessed me.
And they blessed me.
And they blessed me.
And they blessed me.
And they blessed me. I caused the widows' hearts to sing for joy.
Everything I did was honest. Righteousness covered me like a robe, and I wore justice like a turban.
I served as eyes for the blind and feet for the lame.
I was a father to the poor and assisted strangers who needed help.
I broke the jaws of godless oppressors and plucked their victims from their teeth.
I thought, surely I will die surrounded by my family after a long, good life.
For I am like a tree whose roots reach the water, whose branches are refreshed with the dew.
New honours are constantly bestowed on me, and my strength is continually renewed.
Everyone listened to my advice. They were silent as they waited for me to speak.
And after I spoke, they had nothing to add, for my counsel satisfied them.
They longed for me to speak as people long for rain.
They drank my words like a refreshing spring rain.
When they were discouraged, I smiled at them. My look of approval was precious to them.
Like a chief, I told them what to do.
I lived like a king among his troops and comforted those who mourned.
Good morning. It's great to be able to join you today. Thank you to Andrew and his team for this opportunity. And I bring with me this morning greetings from all the team at SIL Australia. And we say thank you for your continued support and interest in the work of SIL Australia. And in particular, we are grateful for your continued support and care for the Brooks and Nichols families. I also bring with me greetings from Stephen Moyaru and Kiru Maggie, who this church generously supported during their year of study here in Australia. They send their warm regards. Today we have the opportunity to reflect together on Job, and I want to encourage us to be like Job. But first, take a minute to think about what you are already like. If you had to categorize who you are or what you're like, what would you say? For example, I've always been fairly tall, but never really thought of myself as tall. Growing up, I was press-ganged into my high school's first basketball team on the basis that I was the tallest kid at school. I'd never seen basketball played before, but I got told that I was playing. I wasn't really aware that I was that tall, perhaps. And it wasn't until we lived in Indonesia that I realized, oh, maybe I am tall, as we looked at our photos with our friends. In that context, I look huge. Another example perhaps might be, how do you answer the question, what do you do? In the olden days, I used to travel by plane around the world. And there was often this funny moment in airports. And people would say things like, what do you do? And then you're struck with, there are different answers, aren't there? I could say, I'm a CEO. Except what does that really say about me? And I'm not sure I like it anyway. Or perhaps I say, I'm a community development worker. Because I kind of look like that, perhaps. Or perhaps if I want to kill the conversation, I just say, I'm a linguist. Because people always say after that, wow, how many languages do you speak? I don't speak any. And after that, it's just awkward silence. How do you see yourself? How do others see you? What categories might you use to describe your identity, your lifestyle, and even your faith? These categories will change for you over the years. For the first 25 years of my life, I would have said resolutely that I am not a public speaker at all. And yet, in the years since then, I've spent a lot of time in front, teaching and leading. And how might Job answer this question of who he is and what's he like? In chapter 29, he reminisces about his previous life. He and his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, had been discussing the reason for Job's suffering. And Job presents a summary of his case, that he has lived a good life and he is innocent of any wrongdoing that might have brought about his current suffering. This chapter, he looks back at his life that's been taken away from him, and he remembers just how good it was, how purposeful his life was. And he remembers his former self in the terms of one single category, that he was righteous, that he lived rightly with God, and he lived rightly with his community. Job claims that his behavior and actions towards God and his neighbors was right and just. And he says that everyone, God and the community, thought that he was not just a good bloke, he was an exceptional human being who lived to the highest godly standards. In the first 6 verses, Job remembers how good his life was when God was his friend, when God watched over him, when Job walked in the light of God's faithfulness and grace. Even during difficult and dark times, his relationship in those days was rich and rewarding. He uses the image of blessing of his farming life. His flocks produced so much milk that his house was overflowing with it. His olive groves produced so much oil, it was like a stream flowing from a rock. Job's walk with God was an abundant one, and he knew and he felt like he was blessed. And then in verses 7 to 11, Job begins to describe his status in the community. Job has a rightful place among the leading men of the city. He has a place among the elders of the city, those who gather to administer justice and peace to their community at the gates of the city. Young men, old men, even nobles paused when Job was with them. There was an air of expectancy around him. He's respected. He must have been wise because everybody is waiting for him to speak. I don't know about you, but in my work here at SALA, we have some wise older souls. And they probably don't often speak in meetings, but we all know that when they do speak, we'll all be quiet and we'll listen in. I know that sometimes now I look at them through the Zoom screen, hoping they would speak, hoping they would share their insight and wisdom. Perhaps this was what Job was like. In the next set of verses, 12 to 17, we see that Job is not only a man of faith and words, he's also a man of action. He rescues the poor. He cares for the orphan. He looks after the destitute and comforts the widow so that she's brought to sing joyfully. This matches the description of pure religion in James 1:27. Pure and genuine religion in the sight of God the Father means caring for orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt you. It also echoes the Old Testament law and the call of the prophets to act justly and defend the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. Job also shows mercy to the blind, the lame, just as Jesus later does. Job does things for them they couldn't do for themselves. He acted as if he was the father to those in need and provided care. He defended strangers and foreigners. Job's heart is not just concerned with the people that he knows. He also actively endeavors to make sure that a vulnerable stranger was not taken advantage of or wrongly accused. In verse 17, we see that Job actually even takes a further step. He not only cares and advocates for the oppressed and marginalized, he also seeks to break the power of the oppressors. These oppressors, he says, act like wild animals who attack helpless prey. Job stands up for the abused. He breaks the fangs of the wicked. He rescues their victims. Job's desire for justice is an active one that wants to make sure that the oppressors in his community can no longer attack and harm others. Notice what a transforming personality Job is in his community. He seeks the best for all. His desire really seems to be that his community live in the fullness of peace, in the fullness of shalom, the Hebrew term for peace. And in the Old Testament, shalom or peace is not just the absence of trouble or war. Peace actually means that things are the way they're supposed to be. Shalom means that people are able to live and look after themselves, that relationships with people are harmonious, that creation itself and our relationship with it is restored and reconciled. It's the way that things are really meant to be. It's the way that God wants things to be. Everything put right, that is true peace. And shalom takes more than just the good actions of a good person. In verse 14, we read that righteousness covered me like a robe. I wore justice for a turban. Righteousness and justice. These two words are associated throughout the Old Testament with the presence of God and the Spirit. Shalom welcomes the Lord and his work among his people. Isaiah 59:17 says that God himself is clothed with righteousness. Job is who he is because God is with him. God's presence is with him. And this is what powers his extraordinary life. The actions of his hands, the words of his mouth, and the desire of his heart reflect God's desire and vision for his community. It's a vision and a thirst for flourishing, for wholeness, healing, and justice, and that people would know God. The picture of Job and his transforming role in the community is a marvelous one, isn't it? He understands his community, he's engaged with his community, and he deeply cares for his community. And he uses his position, his status, and possessions to help his community flourish. I love this word, flourish. Flourishing is becoming a word that SIL globally is using to think about what we want for communities, that communities and individuals would flourish in the languages that they value the most. And the descriptions of Job's actions here in his community bring me also to the words of Isaiah, which Jesus quotes in the synagogue in Luke 4. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, the blind will see, and that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come. And of course, we see examples of this pattern all the way through the Gospels, the life of Jesus, and also the book of Acts in the life of the early church. And in Colossians 3, Paul urges the church to get on with embracing their new identity in Christ. In verses 9 and 10, he reminds them that they have taken off their old self, they've clothed themselves now with their new self, which is renewed and made clean in Christ. Eugene Peterson puts it like this in the Message: "You're done with that old life. It's a filthy set of ill-fitting clothes you were stripped off and put in the fire. Now you're dressed in a new wardrobe. Every item of your new way of life is custom made by the Creator with his label on it. All the old fashions are now obsolete." I like how Peterson captures this image of taking off clothes that are inappropriate and putting on clothes that are associated with God himself. And just as Job was identified with righteous and justice by God's hand, so to the church, the people of Christ are also to take on the very characteristics of Jesus in our words, our actions, right here and right now, in every context we find ourselves. And we have the same goal of shalom as did Job, that the righteousness and justice of God will be a clear marker of our identity. I'm a transplant living here in Victoria. And I've noticed I've developed a very Queensland-centric set of clothes over the past 4 years. Part of my identity is that I grew up in Queensland. I played rugby league at school, and I continue to follow it today. Now I live in Melbourne, I have a couple of hoodies that remind me and make my allegiances clear to others. Just as I express my identity through my hoodies, so too we can take on the righteousness and justice of God as key to our identity. And it'll be clear to everyone that this is part of our makeup. A clear takeaway from this passage for my life is that it is Job's presence in the street, in the marketplace, and at the city gates that enables him to demonstrate God's righteousness and justice. Job is able to help build a flourishing community because he is out and about. He has deep connections. He understands the people around him. He not only sees the needs, he also understands the causes. He cares for the poor. He cares for the oppressed. And he also does what he can to bring the oppressor to justice. Of course, Job's commitment to the Lord does not guarantee that he escapes suffering. Before Job's suffering tears his life apart, Job knew he was blessed by God and loved by his community. He was content. He was grateful. So much so that in verses 18 to 20, he imagines that his life is like a majestic tree. He expects to live a good, long life, nurtured by his walk with God. He never foresaw the catastrophic events that would befall him and his family, that would force him to weep, question his life and his faith. And we too live in uncertain times marked by catastrophe. Yet even in the worst of days, Job comes to see that God is with him in the darkness. And when all is taken away from Job, God remains, and God is enough. Job is distinguished by his reliance on God. Job trusts that the source of righteousness and justice, God himself, will continue to work to vindicate him, silence his oppressors, and lead him back to life. God's past care, guidance, and friendship provides a basis for Job's future hope during his suffering. Job continues to call on God, and God answers and reveals himself to Job in ways beyond what Job could have imagined. Job's character, which was established before he suffered, helps him to persevere, because in the end he trusts that God cares for those like him who suffer. Trusting God in the midst of what each day brings, remembering his presence with us, and relying on his righteousness and justice is more than enough for Job and for us. It's important to recognize where God has put us and to accept the realities of our context and daily lives. God is with us as we come and go within a very safe 5-kilometer radius, or maybe 10 now. And he loves the people we meet within those limits. I suspect if anything like us, God may be using this time to cause some warmer conversation that you might have been able to have in the past. Or at least you'll come across people who are more willing to chat. I know too that since I've had a dog that needs walks and trips to the dog park, we've had some amazing conversations. God has used this time to open up a world of connection with people. What are your connections? Where are the places that you connect to? How does the Croydon Hills Christian community fit into its context? What do you understand about your community's people? And these principles, I think, are the same no matter where you live and work, whether here or overseas. For my wife, Ellie, and I, this is one of the things that have surprised us over the past 30 years of our married life. Whether it's working in a jail in Chicago in the United States, or encouraging a community in Indonesia in its language use, or working in a Chinese church in Brisbane, or now in my role with SALA. The fundamental principles don't change. We have to recognize where God has put us to accept the realities of our context, the realities of our daily lives. Work on building those relationships. Ask the Lord for the ability to notice, to sense opportunities to be kind, to be encouraging, to leave someone with a smile. Learn to be really interested in others. Work on your small talk. I've never been very good at small talk. but I have worked on it over the years. Through those little conversations, another person's world will be open to you and opportunities will emerge. During our time pastoring a Chinese church in Brisbane, we gave a similar challenge to our congregation. One of our dear members and close friends thought it all sounded too hard and scary, being an introvert and all, but she decided she needed to try, praying for opportunities to engage in deeper conversation at work. Well, she was surprised when there was a series of amazing invitations for her to have those deeper chats with people she'd worked with for years. People already knew she was a Christian, but with a little prayer and boldness on her part, God made what seemed impossible possible and even normal. There are diaspora communities all around us here in Melbourne. And one of the big questions that we are asking right now in SAL and SAL Australia is, who are these diaspora communities? Where are they living? What are they experiencing? How are they flourishing? And how are they grappling with their language use, their languages they use, and their identity in their new diaspora home? One of the questions we have is, can we be of further assistance to them as they grapple with these big issues of languages and identity? And so we're about to embark on a project to attempt to survey and assess the diaspora communities in the Melbourne area. For us, this is getting to know our context, seeking to build relationships with community leaders and other advocates, and seeing then what doors that God might open. And as we do these things, we seek to become like Job, a co-worker and demonstrator of God's righteousness and justice in ways that invite shalom to flourish and make God's presence known. Seek to be a peacemaker. And even more so during these challenging times. Be someone who is committed to seeing God's goodness and justice present in your own life and in the life of your community. And may his peace and presence be known to you and those around you in every situation. God bless. Amen.